The photograph that should never have existed. The photograph that documented a marriage Illinois refused to recognize had become proof of something the law couldn't destroy. This woman smiles in the photo, but the real story behind the picture is dark and sad. Dr. Marcus Thompson had been studying old Victorian pictures at the Chicago Historical Society for 15 years, but nothing had gotten him ready for what he found. In an old dusty box labeled Unclaimed Estate, photos from 1882. It was a Tuesday morning in March 2018 when he took out a cardboard-mounted photograph from the collection and felt his breath stop for a moment. The image was a formal studio portrait from the 1880s. A woman sat in a fancy chair, wearing a detailed dark dress with a lace collar. Her blonde hair was styled in the style of that time. Her eyes were open, looking straight at the camera with a strange calm. Her lips formed a small smile. Standing next to her, with his hand gently on her shoulder, was a well-dressed black man in his 30s. He wore a nice suit with a watch chain across his vest. At first look, Marcus thought it was just an unusual photo for that period. A white woman and a black man posing together in the 1880s would have been very rare, but something about the woman's face made him look more carefully. Her eyes, though open, had a glassy look. Her smile seemed stiff and not real. Her body was too still and too perfect. Marcus had studied enough old photography to know what this was. This was a post-mortem photograph, a usual custom back then, when families wanted one final picture of their loved one who had died. But post-mortem subjects were usually shown with closed eyes, made to look peacefully asleep. This woman's eyes were wide open, staring at the camera. Someone had wanted her to look alive. He turned the photograph over. On the back, in faded brown ink, someone had written, Margaret and Samuel Thompson Studio, Chicago, April 14, 1882. Below that, in different handwriting, smaller and harder to read, the only photograph taken 3 hours after her passing. May God forgive us all. Marcus felt a cold shiver down his back. He put the photograph on his desk and looked at it under the lamp. The man's face, Samuel, showed deep sadness that was hard to see. His eyes were red, his jaw was tight. His hand on her shoulder shook a little, making a small blur in the sharp image. But it was Margaret's face that stayed with Marcus. Her eyes were open, yes, but there was something more. A smile. Someone had arranged her face, maybe changed her features to make a smile. In death, they had made her look happy. Marcus took out his magnifying glass and checked every small detail in the image. The studio background showed a painted garden. Fresh flowers were in a vase next to the chair. White roses and lilies. Flowers for funerals. Margaret's left hand rested in her lap, and on her ring finger was a simple gold band. Samuel wore the same kind of ring. Marcus spent the next 3 days looking up information about Thompson's studio. He learned it had worked on the south side of Chicago, from 1875 to 1889. It was owned by a photographer named Albert Thompson, who did both living portraits and post-mortem pictures. The studio helped a mixed group of people, which was not common then, including some of Chicago's small but growing black middle class. He found the studio's record book in the Historical Society's archives. The entries were careful, listing each client, the type of photo, and the price. Marcus looked through pages of names until he saw the entry for April 14, 1882. Samuel Bennett, Special Memorial Portrait. $5 paid in full. Note, client insists, subject's eyes remain open. Unusual request honored. $5 was a huge amount in 1882, almost a week's pay for most workers. Samuel had paid extra for this photograph, and for the photographer's care in making something that went against usual rules of post-mortem photography. But what Marcus found next made him see this was more than just an unusual old death portrait. In the Historical Society's newspaper records, he looked for any mention of Margaret and Samuel Bennett in April 1882. What he found was one short article in the Chicago Tribune, dated April 16, 1882, hidden on page 7. Woman dies in childbirth. Margaret Wilson, aged 26, died Friday evening during labor at a house on Dearborn Street. The child did not survive. No family has come forward to claim the body. The deceased was reportedly living with a Negro man. Circumstances unknown. The coroner has ruled the death natural causes. Burial arrangements pending. Margaret Wilson, not Margaret Bennett. The newspaper had not accepted a marriage, had not named Samuel, only called him a Negro man. Marcus felt his hands shake as he held the printout from the microfilm reader. He searched marriage records for Cook County, Illinois, looking for any record of Margaret Wilson and Samuel Bennett. He checked from 1870 through 1882. Nothing. He looked in nearby counties. Still nothing. He tried other states where mixed-race marriage might have been allowed at that time. There were only a few. Finally, in the Massachusetts State Archives, he found it. Marriage license issued September 3, 1879. Samuel Bennett, Negro, age 27, laborer, and Margaret Wilson, white, age 23, seamstress, both of Boston, Massachusetts. They had been legally married in Massachusetts, but when they moved to Illinois, their marriage was not accepted. In Illinois in 1882, interracial marriage was against the law. Their marriage paper meant nothing. In the eyes of Illinois law, they were not husband and wife. Samuel was simply a Negro man living with a white woman, an arrangement that could bring danger, arrest, or worse. Marcus looked back at the photograph. Samuel's hand on Margaret's shoulder, the matching rings, the strong effort to make one image where they existed together as husband and wife. Marcus knew he needed to learn more about Samuel Bennett. The 1880 census for Chicago listed a Samuel Bennett, black male, age 28, occupation carpenter. The address was on Dearborn Street, the same street in the newspaper article about Margaret's death. He searched through city lists, property records, and business papers. Samuel had been skilled and hard-working. In 1880, he was listed as a carpenter. By 1881, he had started a small furniture workshop. He was building a life, making his place in a city where black men faced big problems to get ahead. Then Marcus found something very special, a legal paper filed in Cook County Court in October 1879, just weeks after Samuel and Margaret's marriage in Massachusetts. It was a request filed by Samuel Bennett, asking for recognition of his Massachusetts marriage license in Illinois. The request was written in formal legal words, but the feeling behind it was clear. I, Samuel Bennett, a free man and citizen of these United States, hereby petition this court to recognize the lawful marriage contracted between myself and Margaret Wilson on September 24, 3rd, 1879, in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. We are husband and wife before God and under the law of Massachusetts. We seek only to live peacefully as a married couple in this city. The request was denied. The judge's decision was short and cold. Marriage between Negro and white persons is prohibited under Illinois law. The petition is denied. The alleged marriage contracted in Massachusetts has no legal standing in this jurisdiction. Marcus found another paper from 1880. Samuel had tried again, this time with a lawyer, saying that the full faith and credit part of the Constitution required Illinois to accept a valid Massachusetts marriage. Again denied. Samuel had fought for 2 years to have his marriage accepted. He had spent money he probably could not afford on lawyers and court costs. He had put himself in danger. A black man publicly asking for his rights in 1880 Chicago, saying that a white woman was his legal wife, and he had failed. In the eyes of Illinois law, Margaret was not his wife. Their love, their promise, their marriage ceremony in Boston, none of it mattered. They lived together anyway, knowing the risk. Samuel worked. Margaret took in sewing. They built a quiet life together in a city that would not accept their marriage. Then, in April 1882, Margaret went into labor. Something went wrong. In a time before modern medicine, childbirth was risky for all women, but especially for those without good medical help. Did Samuel call a doctor? Would a doctor come to help a white woman living with a black man? The newspaper said nothing about medical care. Margaret died. So did their child. And Samuel was left alone with a sadness that no one would accept, because officially, he had lost nothing. She was not his wife. The child was not his child. He was just a Negro man whose arrangement had ended. Marcus needed to understand why Albert Thompson, the photographer, had agreed to take such a picture. In 1882 Chicago, making a portrait of a dead white woman with a black man would have been risky, not just socially wrong, but possibly violent. Thompson was risking his business, perhaps even his safety. He searched for more details about Thompson's studio and found something important. Albert Thompson had been a Union Army photographer during the Civil War. He had recorded battlefields, soldiers, and the conditions of freed slaves in camps. After the war, he had settled in Chicago and opened his studio. In the Chicago Historical Society's archives, Marcus found a collection of Thompson's personal papers that had been given decades earlier, but never fully organized. Inside were business records, letters, and a journal Thompson had kept from time to time. The journal entry from April 14, 1882, was short but strong. A colored man came to the studio today with a request that troubled me greatly. His wife, though he cannot call her that legally in this state, had died the previous night in childbirth. He wanted a photograph together, just one photograph, where they could exist as husband and wife. He showed me their marriage certificate from Massachusetts. Legal there, meaningless here. He wept as he spoke, said they had never had a photograph taken together. Too dangerous. People would ask questions. There could be violence. But now she was gone, and he wanted one image, just one, to prove they had existed, to prove she had been his wife. I told him I would do it, though I knew the risks. He carried her body to the studio himself, wrapped in clean linens. We positioned her in the chair. He insisted her eyes be open, said he couldn't bear to photograph her sleeping, wanted her to be looking at him one last time. I have photographed many dead in my years, soldiers, children, elderly, but never have I felt such deep sorrow as I did watching this man position his wife's body, arrange her dress, try to make a smile on her face. He whispered to her the entire time, told her he loved her, asked her forgiveness for bringing her to a place that wouldn't recognize their marriage. When the photograph was complete, he paid me $5, more than I usually charge. He held the wet plate as it developed, staring at the image forming. Then he carried her body back home. I do not know what became of him. I do not know if he was ever able to bury her properly, or if she was placed in a potter's field with no name. But I know this. I witnessed love today. Real love, the kind that lasts despite laws, despite hatred, despite death itself. Marcus sat back in his chair, deeply moved. This was not just a post-mortem photograph. This was an act of resistance. Samuel had brought his wife's body to a photographer, carrying her through the streets to create proof of their marriage that the law would not accept. Marcus realized he knew almost nothing about Margaret. The historical record had reduced her to a short death notice. Margaret Wilson, aged 26, died. He needed to find out who she had been before she became a name in an obituary. He searched census records and found her family. Margaret Wilson had been born in 1856 in Springfield, Illinois, to Irish immigrant parents. Her father, Thomas Wilson, was a railroad worker. Her mother, Catherine, had died in 1872, when Margaret was 16. The 1870 census showed Margaret living with her parents and 3 younger siblings. By 1880, Margaret wasn't listed in her father's house anymore. Marcus searched city lists and found her in Chicago, listed as a seamstress, staying at a house on State Street, a respectable place for working women. Then he found something that gave important background, a letter saved in a collection of papers from the Chicago Women's Trade Union. The letter was dated August 1879, written by Margaret Wilson to her younger sister Emma, who still lived in Springfield. The letter had been kept because Emma had later given her sister's letters to a women's group, wanting to record the lives of working women in the 1880s. Marcus's hand shook as he read, "Dearest Emma, I must tell you something that will surprise you, but I hope you will understand. I have met someone. His name is Samuel. He is kind and good and works as a carpenter. He is also a Negro. I know what people will say. I know Father would be angry, but Emma, he treats me with such respect and gentleness. We have spent months walking together in the evenings, talking about everything, books, politics, our dreams for the future. He wants to marry me. I want to marry him. We are traveling to Boston next week, where such marriages are legal. I do not know what will come of this. I know we will face hatred and problems, but I also know that I love him, and he loves me, and that must count for something. Please do not tell Father yet. I will write to him when the time is right. Perhaps he will understand, perhaps not, but I must follow my heart. Your loving sister, Margaret." Marcus found no record of Margaret ever writing to her father. Thomas Wilson died in 1885, 3 years after Margaret. His obituary listed his surviving children, Emma, and 2 sons, but made no mention of Margaret. She had been removed from the family record. He searched for Emma and found her in the 1900 census, married with children of her own. In a Chicago newspaper from 1901, there was a small notice about a women's suffrage meeting. Emma Wilson Harris had spoken about her sister Margaret, who had died tragically young and whose marriage was not recognized by unfair laws. Emma had remembered. Emma had kept her sister's letters. Emma had tried in her own way to make sure Margaret's story was not completely lost. As Marcus continued his research, he discovered that Samuel and Margaret had not been alone. There was a small hidden group of mixed-race couples in 1880s Chicago, people who lived quietly, carefully, always aware of the danger they faced. He found evidence of this group in unexpected places. Church records from a small Presbyterian church on the South Side showed several marriages done for mixed-race couples, though the minister noted that these were spiritual unions, since Illinois would not accept them legally. Property records showed a few homes owned by black men, where white women also lived, though never listed as wives, sometimes as housekeepers or boarders. Thin covers that fooled no one, but gave a little legal safety. Newspaper records showed the violence these couples faced. An 1881 article described an attack on a home where a black man and white woman lived together. The mob had broken windows and threatened to burn the house. Police had arrested the couple for improper living rather than protecting them from the mob. A coroner's report from 1883 looked into the death of a white woman named Catherine Moore, found beaten to death in an alley. The report showed she had been married to a black man named James Moore in Ohio, where their marriage was legal. When they moved to Chicago, they faced constant trouble. Her family had rejected her. Witnesses reported seeing a group of white men following her on the night she died. No one was ever arrested for her murder. Marcus found a memoir published in 1920 by a Chicago minister who had worked in the South Side in the 1880s. In it he wrote, "There existed in those days a number of couples who had legally married in other states, but found themselves unrecognized and persecuted in Illinois. They lived in constant fear, not just of legal trouble, but of violence from neighbors who saw their unions as wrong. Many of these couples lost everything: families who rejected them, jobs they could not keep, homes they were forced from. Some disappeared entirely, and one suspects the worst. The courage it took to keep a relationship under such conditions was extraordinary." These were love stories made in the face of hatred. Samuel and Margaret had been part of this hidden group. They had found each other, married legally where they could, and then tried to build a life in a place that denied their bond. They had lived, knowing that any day might bring violence, that Margaret's family might never speak to her again, that Samuel could be arrested on false charges at any moment. And they had done it anyway. For 3 years, they had built a home together. They had hoped for a future. They had conceived a child. Then, in one terrible night, it had all ended. Marcus realized he still did not know what had happened after the photograph was taken. Where was Margaret buried? What became of Samuel? He searched cemetery records throughout Chicago, looking for Margaret Wilson or Margaret Bennett, buried in April 1882. He found her in the records of Oakwood Cemetery, a large cemetery on the South Side. The entry was plain: Margaret Wilson died April 13, 1882, aged 26. Cause childbirth. Buried April 16, 1882. Section 12, Lot 847. Burial, paid by S. Bennett. Section 12 was the Potter's Field, the area for the poor, criminals, and those without family to claim them. Unmarked graves, dozens of bodies buried in shared plots. Margaret had been placed there, her grave unmarked, her name recorded only in a book, but Samuel had paid for the burial. Marcus found the receipt in the cemetery's financial records, $3. The first zero, paid by Samuel Bennett for burial of Margaret Wilson. It was all he could afford, but he had made sure she was buried properly, not just thrown away. Marcus visited Oakwood Cemetery on a cold morning in April, almost exactly 136 years after Margaret's burial. Section 12 was a flat, grassy area, with a few old stones marking the boundaries. There were no individual markers. Hundreds of people lay beneath that ground, their names forgotten, their stories lost. He stood there, looking at the grass, knowing Margaret was somewhere beneath his feet. She had been 26 years old. She had loved Samuel. She had married him, despite knowing the cost she would pay. She had carried his child. She had died bringing that child into a world that would have rejected it as cruelly as it had rejected their marriage. And Samuel had carried her body through the streets of Chicago to a photographer's squat studio to create one image, one piece of proof that their love had existed, that their marriage had been real, that she had been his wife. Marcus pulled out his phone and took a photograph of Section 12, an unmarked field, plain earth. But he knew the truth now. Margaret was there, and her story finally would be told. Back at the Historical Society, Marcus continued searching for traces of Samuel. What had happened to him after Margaret's death? Had he stayed in Chicago? Had he survived? The trail was weak, but he found pieces. In the 1883 city directory, Samuel Bennett was no longer listed at the Dearborn Street address. The furniture workshop was gone. Marcus found a property record showing the workshop had been sold in August 1882, 4 months after Margaret's death, for a small part of its value. Then, nothing. Samuel disappeared from Chicago records completely. Marcus looked beyond Chicago. If Samuel had left the city after Margaret's death, where would he have gone? He searched census records, city lists, death certificates, anywhere Samuel Bennett might have shown up. In the 1890 census, 8 years after Margaret's death, Marcus found him. Samuel Bennett, black male, age 38. Occupation, carpenter, living in Detroit, Michigan. He was living in a boarding house, unmarried, working in a furniture factory. Marcus found more traces. A city directory from 1895 listed Samuel Bennett as owning a small carpentry shop on Gratiot Bay in Detroit. He was building a life again, slowly, carefully. Then in a collection of papers from a Detroit church, Marcus found something special. A letter written by Samuel in 1896 to the pastor of Second Baptist Church, a well-known black church in Detroit. The letter was a request to join the church, and in it, Samuel told part of his story. Reverend, I come to you seeking a spiritual home. I have been alone for many years now. I was married once lawfully before God in Massachusetts in 1879. My wife was named Margaret. She was a good woman, a Christian woman. We were happy, though the world made our happiness hard. She died in Chicago in 1882, along with our unborn child. I've carried the grief of that loss every day since. I left Chicago because I could not bear to remain in the place where we had tried to build our life together. I have lived quietly here in Detroit, working, attending services when I could, but I have not truly been part of a community. I am ready now to belong again, to be part of a church family. I am not asking for pity. I'm asking for a place to worship and to serve. Your servant in Christ, Samuel Bennett. The pastor's note at the bottom of the letter read, Mr. Bennett was welcomed into our congregation on Easter Sunday, 1896. He's a man of deep faith and quiet dignity. Marcus found Samuel's name in the church records for the next 15 years. He attended services regularly. He taught carpentry skills to young men in the church's job training program. He gave what he could to the church's charity fund. He was a respected member of the community. In 1911, the church newsletter included a short announcement. We mourn the passing of our brother Samuel Bennett, who died peacefully on March 12th at the age of 59. Brother Bennett was a faithful member of our congregation for 15 years and will be remembered for his kindness, his skill, and his generous spirit. He is survived by no immediate family, but he was family to us all. Samuel was buried in Detroit, Elmwood Cemetery, in a section for members of Second Baptist Church. His grave had a simple marker, Samuel Bennett, 1852 to 1911, beloved brother in Christ. Marcus made plans to travel to Detroit. He needed to see Samuel's grave to finish the circle of this story. Standing in Elmwood Cemetery in Detroit, Marcus looked at Samuel's gravestone. It was modest, but well kept in a section with dozens of other graves from the same church community. Samuel had found belonging here eventually. He had been remembered. mourned, laid to rest with dignity. But Marcus thought about the photograph. Samuel had lived 29 years after Margaret's death. He had rebuilt his life, found a community, done good work, but he had never remarried. He had carried Margaret with him for nearly 3 decades, the only woman he ever called his wife. Marcus had brought a copy of the photograph with him. He placed it on Samuel's gravestone and took a picture with his phone, the photograph of the photograph, creating a connection across time. Samuel and Margaret reunited, at least in memory. Back in Chicago, Marcus prepared to share his findings. He knew the story would touch many people in 2018, a year when talks about race, love, and justice were big in the country. But he wanted to do more than just write a research paper. He wanted Margaret and Samuel's story to reach people, to help them understand what love looked like against hatred. He contacted a journalist at the Chicago Tribune, the same newspaper that had reduced Margaret to a 3-line death notice in 1882. The journalist, a woman named Patricia Chen, was very interested right away. She came to the Historical Society to see the photograph and read through Marcus's research. Patricia stared at the photograph for a long time. "Her eyes are open," she said quietly. "She's looking right at the camera, right at us." Samuel insisted on that, Marcus explained. The photographer wrote about it. He couldn't bear to photograph her sleeping. He wanted her to be looking at him one last time. Patricia turned the photograph over, reading the inscription. The only photograph taken 3 hours after her passing. "May God forgive us all." She looked up at Marcus. "Who wrote that?" "The photographer." "I believe so." Thompson felt the weight of what he was recording. Not just death, but unfairness. A marriage that was legal in one state, but criminal in another. A love that existed despite laws made to make it impossible. Patricia began writing the article that week. She interviewed Marcus many times, reviewed all his research, and visited both Oakwood Cemetery in Chicago and Elmwood Cemetery in Detroit. She found descendants of Emma, Margaret's sister, and showed them the photograph and letters Marcus had found. One of Emma's great-granddaughters, a woman named Rachel, cried when she saw the photograph. "We always knew there was a sister," she said. "My grandmother mentioned Margaret a few times, said she had married someone the family did not approve of, and that she'd died young, but that's all we knew. We did not know about Samuel. We did not know she'd been happy, that she'd chosen love over family approval. I wish I'd known her." The Tribune article was published on February 14, 2019, Valentine's Day. Patricia had titled it, "The Only Photograph, a Love Story That Illinois Law Refused to Recognize." The article became very popular. Within hours, it was being shared across social media, discussed on news shows, and picked up by national media. People were drawn to the photograph, by Margaret's open eyes and fixed smile, by Samuel's grief-filled face, by the single image that showed a marriage Illinois had denied. But more than that, people were touched by the story of love lasting against impossible problems. Margaret and Samuel had married, knowing they would face hatred, violence, and legal trouble. They had built a life together anyway. They had conceived a child together. And when Margaret died, Samuel had done something special. He had carried her body through the streets to create one photograph that proved what the law denied, that she had been his wife. The story started talks about the long history of laws against interracial marriage in America. These laws had existed in many states well into the 20th century. The Supreme Court did not end them nationwide until 1967, with the Loving v. Virginia decision. Millions of couples had been affected by these laws, their marriages denied, their families broken apart. The photograph of Margaret and Samuel became a symbol. Museums asked for permission to show it. Teachers used it in lessons about the history of racism and resistance. A playwright in Boston wrote a play based on their story. The photograph that Samuel had risked everything to create was finally being seen, finally showing their love. Marcus worked with the Historical Society to create a proper memorial. In Oakwood Cemetery in Section 12, where Margaret lay in an unmarked grave, they put up a memorial stone. Margaret Wilson Bennett, 1856 to 1882, beloved wife of Samuel Bennett, married legally in Massachusetts, September 3, 1879. Their love went beyond unfair laws. In Detroit, Second Baptist Church added a plaque near Samuel's grave. Samuel Bennett, 1852 to 1911. Husband of Margaret Wilson Bennett, he loved faithfully, lived with dignity, and never forgot. The photograph stayed at the Chicago Historical Society, but it was no longer put away in a box. It was shown openly, with the full story of Margaret and Samuel next to it. Visitors stood before it, reading about the couple who had married in Boston, lived in Chicago, and died apart. Margaret in 1882, Samuel in 1911, but who had loved each other across the divide of death and law. Marcus often visited the photograph. He would stand before it looking at Margaret's open eyes, staring out from 1882, at Samuel's, hand on her shoulder at the matching rings on their fingers. He thought about the courage it took to love someone, when the law said that love was criminal. He thought about Samuel carrying Margaret's body through the streets, about the photographer who risked his business to record their marriage, about the single image that survived when everything else had been taken from them. The photograph looked like a normal Victorian portrait. A woman and a man formally posed in a studio, but behind that image was a story of deep love and deep unfairness. A story of a marriage that was legal in one state, but criminal in another. A story of a woman who chose love over family approval and paid with her life. A story of a man who spent 29 years mourning his wife and never stopped calling her by that name, even when the law said he had no right to. The truth behind the portrait was dark. A darkness of laws made to destroy love, of violence meant to enforce hatred, of a society that valued racial separation over human happiness. But within that darkness there was light, the light of Margaret and Samuel's love, which had lasted despite everything, the light of their courage in choosing each other, the light of the photograph itself, which had survived 137 years to finally tell their story. And now, finally, people knew. The woman smiling in the photograph had loved and been loved. She had been someone's wife. Her death had been mourned. Her memory had been carried for decades by a man who never forgot her. The photograph that should never have existed, the photograph that documented a marriage Illinois refused to recognize, had become proof of something the law couldn't destroy.